Welcome back, everybody, to the Growing Pains podcast. My name is Yoli Chisholm, and I lead marketing here at Outforce. And I'm excited to have a conversation with Stephen Bandola, who is our very own tech lead here. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Yoli. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. And for those who don't know, Growing Pains is the podcast where we talk to founders, tech leads, and those who are in the practice of building engineering teams and building great companies and talk to them about their growing pains. So today, we're going to have a conversation with Stephen. And why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your background and what your role here is at Outforce and how you came to be in software development.
Sure. Yeah. Um, okay, so I'm Stephen Bandola. I've been writing code for about 20 years now. I started just as a kid tinkering in my bedroom, like making websites. I think my first app was getting my whole pirated music collection on the school FTP server and then linking it all on a website. So I was basically running Spotify for me and my friends when I was like, I don't know, 14, at least for my private music collection. And I kind of got started that way. There's a bunch of little projects I undertook as a teenager, but then as I graduated and kind of moved into my more professional career, I started doing websites, and then eventually I realized how much easier it was to go with WordPress. But then I needed to learn PHP in order to make like add-ons and plugins for WordPress. So I started with PHP, and then worked on that for a while. That was back in like the IE6 days where like you'd have to build the same site like 4 different times for like different browsers and different instances. It was a whole
Oh,
nightmare, but if anyone listening
the good old days.
remembers those times, it was a fun time to be a web developer, that's for sure. But yeah, so I got started with PHP. Then from there, kind of got tired of WordPress with how slow it was and difficult some things were, and decided to go custom with like the backend framework of Laravel. So I got into Laravel from there, and from because it's a backend framework, I was looking for something more front end. So I eventually that's how I got into React, and then from React, I kind of got into like Vue, and then like that whole like side of things. And long story short, now I'm working on a next stack with like a Postgres database, and I mean I can work with all kinds of databases now, but basically that's little bit of my like story. I don't know, it's a little bit like super fast forwarded, obviously,
Yeah.
but and
And
then yeah, that kind of gave me an opportunity to join the Outforce team as the lead engineer here. Um, uh, it's been great so far. There's been lots of interesting, fun tasks, and yeah, I love it here. So
so, in your career, can you just give us a sense of what types of companies you've had the opportunity to work with? Have they been mostly startups or enterprise organizations, or like what's been sort of the engineering team makeup?
yeah, good question. So like probably I would say 95% startups. Um, The main reason is because I'm really good as an engineer of going from like 0 to 1, right? Like taking an idea or a dream or a vision and trying to build like software solutions that solve business problems, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of been more my specialty. So I think that's what makes me a good fit for my role here at Outforce. But it also having a lot of experience with, I mean, I've probably worked with at least a dozen startups over the
Yeah.
last 10 years, and we've hired teams from anywhere from being just me, which is uh, challenging, to I think the most engineers I've had under me was like I think 6 or 7. So kind of small scale, but we've been very rapid, and
Yeah.
we've been able to do a lot with a little. So
Yeah. But you're also working with clients who are scaling their teams
mhm.
um, and leveraging, outsourcing. It feels like outsourcing has gone through its own kind of evolution in terms of how people perceive it.
Hmm.
Maybe you can just share a little bit about, what's the current perspective in terms of startups using outsourcing? What are the benefits and challenges, and how has that perception changed over the years?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So like when I first got started, the typical like you'd view outsourcing as kind of like when you have a bunch of repetitive, very simple, very like menial tasks, you would
Yeah,
outsource that to some team overseas, usually because they'd be so much cheaper and but then you'd have questionable quality sometimes. And it was kind of viewed as kind of like only for simple things. You really couldn't rely on foreign teams to deliver quality or something that's going to last long term. So
yeah,
you might get code that works, but is the code well written? Is it maintainable? Is it documented? Is there best practices involved? In best case scenario, you get best practices that were like 2 years old,
right.
right? So that was my experience, like kind of coming up in the industry. But in the last couple of years, outsourcing has become a lot more viable, um, primarily because I think both the affordability of outsourcing has gone, well, it's become a little bit more expensive, but that in a way it's a little bit more reassuring because you know that for a higher price point, you should be getting higher quality. So the expectation goes up as well.
Yeah,
Um, and then, yeah, recently I've found hiring like or outsourcing a team that's located overseas or somewhere further away, it's actually can be quite beneficial, right? We used to kind of avoid it because you would lose the learnings that you would encounter as a team if you, as opposed to like just hiring your own team, you get
yeah,
to keep everything you learn as you build the app, right? But things have become quite homogenous in the software development ecosystem now, where like um, a front end app is a front end app. A back end server is a back end server. And there's a lot of it's almost like best practices have penetrated to a point where if you understand one, there's a decent chance that you can get on and understand another. So the difference between building like an old school server in PHP or Laravel versus like now where you'd build it in like not that you wouldn't use Laravel, but now we use like Next or Nest for an API or something like that.
yeah,
It's it's a lot more easy to tell if you're getting quality and also the tools like things like GitHubs and PRs and actions and things like that have really simplified the process of testing the code that you get from foreign teams. So you can have a lot more assurance that the code that's being delivered is quality, that it works, that it runs, that it's testable. Um, and as a result, I'd say outsourcing becomes a lot more attractive because you still get to keep the learnings. It's all in your code base. You see all the commits.
yeah,
But at the same time, uh, you're able to, especially with our team, you're able to hire a team that already knows how to work together. They already kind of speak the same language, even if you don't, right? You don't necessarily need the whole team to speak English. You only need the lead or the person that you're communicating with to
right.
speak English. And so I guess you could say it's become a lot more attractive and a lot more viable.
Yeah, and how do you, I guess as that has happened, so has the number of agencies that are available and the breadth and depth and geographical scope of available engineering agencies. So how do you choose the right outsourcing model and partner agency for your project? What are some of the criteria you're looking for?
Yeah, another really good question. I'd probably say like for choosing the right or outsourcing model, you want to find something that A works well with with the experience that you have on your team.
Right.
So whether I would almost always recommend hiring like a lead engineer or somebody that's going to take all of the delivered code and at least can understand it, right? In most cases, I would recommend like if you have a technical CTO, if you have a non-technical CTO, the model that would probably work better is if you hire a team lead
Yeah.
or even outsource a team lead, as long as you have good communication with them, and then have that person kind of administrate or manage the team. and manage the project and the incoming commits, right?
Yeah.
For our case, since I'm like for our case with Outforce, I would probably say that the outsourcing model that we would choose is on a developer by developer basis. So we like to kind of cherry pick the developers that we like.
Yeah.
And so in our case, our outsourcing model is the developers need to have some proven experience, a decent portfolio, and also if we're finding them on an existing team, a recommendation of like what are they good at, where do they fit best on a team, more front end, more back end, et
Right.
cetera, right? Um, so I guess that kind of depends on the company and the experience that you have on your team. Um,
And
but
what about how do
yeah,
you choose the right agency?
right. So the right agency, you're going to look for a company that has a proven track record. There's a lot of ways to evaluate an agency before you ever even talk to them using like online tools and just searching them. You can find things like reviews, their the tools or the stack that they're experienced with, things that they've had successes with, things that they've struggled with. And then the other thing is like for me, if I'm looking to outsource a team with like its own lead,
Yeah.
I need to have a good relationship with them, right? Like I don't want to feel like things get tense very quickly, right? Because there will be some miscommunication errors. And I'd say communication is like A1. Like
Yeah.
if I can't like get to the bottom of an issue quickly with the lead of the outsourcing team that I've brought in, it's going to add friction to every other step essentially, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I'd say that's part of it. Uh,
It's
Choosing the right agency, I think it comes down to do they have the proven history? Because I don't know about you, but I probably wouldn't feel comfortable hiring a brand new team with zero projects under their belt, right?
yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I'd probably start there in terms of a selection for an agency
Yeah.
and go from there.
And we often hear sometimes, the reasons why outsourcing may actually not go well. Maybe some of these intangibles like, culture fit. Um, what are some of the things that folks should sort of look out for when they're doing their search for an agency or candidates, and that can help ensure that they're not in the failure rate bucket.
Um, so right now, there's not a lot of options to have a 100% assurance,
Sure.
right? Um, So, I mean, I'll do a little Outforce plug here. One of the things you could do is go through Outforce. And one of the benefits that we offer is if it doesn't work out, we can replace them. We have
Right.
a large network of a ton of agencies, teams, individuals, et cetera, um, where there's always going to be some inherent risk in outsourcing. But when you go through a service like Outforce, what you get is you get the replacement assurance. So if it doesn't work out, we can find another engineer. And we've already done the searches when we were preparing the account. So
Right.
we have like 4 or 5 backups that we could sub in or uh, essentially make sure that you're going to get the quality engineering that you need to finish your project. And yeah, so that would be like I mean, that's a plug for Outforce. That's what we do,
Yeah.
but it's true, right? There's no way to have that 100% assurance,
Yeah.
and
Just like
that's one of
in regular, when you're hiring sort of full-time, uh, you know, but I think what's perceived sometimes is that when we talk about culture, we're talking about language, but it isn't just, can they speak English, is it?
no, it's so you can tell when you're talking to an engineer or an engineering lead
Yeah.
who's been involved in the industry for 3 to 5 years versus somebody who like is maybe coming from even just like a front end engineer with like one year of experience. A lot of times, these guys, if they're really good in their company, they can get promoted, but they don't have uh, that management experience that really makes them great at communicating with with teams other than their own.
Yeah,
Um, the thing that's kind of evolved is like a common language between say an engineering team or engineers between each other. And then I'd say that's kind of like the common language, right? It's like an experienced developer knows how to communicate with other developers, with their project
right.
lead. And if you have a project lead that isn't an experienced developer, they have that ability to communicate effectively and really like nail down and drill down and isolate the root cause of each individual issue so you can solve it and move forward, right? And that's something that I would say is crucial um, when you're hiring and or when you're contracting an outsourcing team. I did
Yeah,
want to make one comment on something you
sure.
said. Uh, when you hire a developer versus or hire like a maybe you're doing a hiring sprint and you want 5 developers,
Right.
the risk is still there either way, right? One of the benefits of outsourcing, at least through Outforce, is that um, when you when you outsource through Outforce, you get that replacement assurance. Whereas even
Yeah,
when you're hiring versus even if you're trying to contract just like a developer or a team of developers, um, that assurance, that risk is still there implicitly, right? If
yeah,
if anything, I would say for hiring a full-time or even part-time employee, you have the risk of, you have to do the training, you have to get to know them, and then usually after only about 3 months, you can kind of tell if it's going to work or not. Sometimes you can do it earlier, but I'd say the risk is inherent in any hiring process. So yeah, again, little plug for Outforce. That's one of the problems that we solve, and one of the most valuable ways to look at outsourcing through Outforce.
yeah, you can definitely plug away. How do you ensure the quality and security of the software that's delivered? Are there
Mhm.
sort of standard best practices, or how do you do that when you're
Well,
outsourcing?
there's a lot of automated solutions, like just bots you can get to run on your GitHub repository that'll actually find your security vulnerabilities. I mean,
Okay.
that's like a first step, and once you have it set up, then it can kind of show you where you have vulnerabilities. But second of all, um, in terms of the code quality and whether or not it's up to snuff, uh, I would say you can read it, which is usually the process that I would encourage if you have a technical founder or a technical project lead on your side that's actually like on in your company.
Yeah.
And then just review each PR, at least the big ones, before they get merged into your main branch. Um,
Well, there's
that's
kind
pro
of two sides to the security, right? Like I think what you're talking about is more like making sure that the code you're getting is secure. But
Mhm.
what about in the case of startups, where you're trying to protect IP, but you're outsourcing the the development?
Yeah, so I mean th that because if you hire a developer or if there's a developer working on your project, they're going to
Yeah,
clone the entire repository to their machine, usually, right? Um, the best way that I've seen to do that is through actual just contracts. Make sure it's really clear in your agreement with the outsourcing company that IP that is worked on and the code that gets delivered is 100% yours at the end of the day and
right.
uh, maintains ownership under your company. In the odd case, you will have a developer who's like, oh yeah, I have this code base. Now I'm going to make a bunch of modifications to it and host it as a competitor. That's a worst case scenario.
Yeah,
Um, I think that risk gets mitigated when you're actually trying to select the right agency.
right,
Because if that's going to happen to you, there's a decent chance it's happened before. And so that company is not going to have the greatest reputation. So that would be something to look out for during the selection process.
right.
Once they're hired, um, there are like, I mean, using like permissions management within GitHub and your the tools and the stack that you use for managing the project, it's fairly easy to kick somebody off and to take away their permissions. But at the end of the day, that code is still downloaded to their machine. And um, the in my opinion, maybe I'm not like totally uh, versed enough to give like the best answer for this, but um, when it comes down to it, the the best way to ensure that is to have a good legal contract between the vendor or the outsourcing agency and your company.
Yeah. Um, how do you think about fostering innovation when you're collaborating with an outsourced agency? There is this old perception of you know, chop shops and just
Mhm.
sort of piecework. But I do quite often hear it, from our clients that, they feel like um, these engineers become a part of their team. In
Mhm.
your case, how have you kind of fostered that sort of innovation and integration?
Yeah, so clear requirements. That's my first line of defense to my first line of defense, and it's also like when a developer takes on a task or an issue, I let them see everything that they need to. So it's like the only things that are hidden from them are the things that are like legally would need to be. I don't think I don't think that having this like really rigid structure of like you must do this and then basically defining the requirements and giving the task to the developer so that they own the task until it's complete. Also give them a full understanding of what your company is doing, what the app is doing, and give them all the information, right? Because a developer, like 10 out of 10 times, you want them to be smart. You want them to be able to figure things out and understand a task in the context of its business application, right? And I think you just kind of evaluate that on an individual basis, on a developer by developer basis of like, can they actually implement a feature based on the requirements and the instructions given, but have a well-written, like for an issue, if they're going to take out an issue and create a pull request from it, make sure that they have all the information that they need to complete it, make sure that they have all the information about the app in general so that they're not going to accidentally break something. And when that does happen, because, development can sometimes be, 4 or 5 developers working on similar tasks or like close to the same branch, you'll have a couple overwrites and a couple issues there. Um, but I'd say like give the team uh, the ability to communicate with each other and with you at any time and see clarity whenever they want and keep that pressure low, right? There's kind of like there can be a stigma when you're talking to a developer like, okay, I'm giving you this task, it better be perfect, or like I'm really like looking at your quality as a developer by looking at the quality of this PR. It's like sometimes the code is bad because they didn't understand the task. And I think it comes down to building like a good company culture around how you develop software and not having unrealistic expectations and these like ego inflated kind of
Mm,
uh, like this ego inflated environment where my product is going to be the best and you
right.
have to you have to be a 10-star developer or something like that, right?
Yeah. Um, how do you think about actually historically, there have been geographical locations in countries that have been sort of synonymous with outsourcing, whether it's India for development, whether it's, Philippines for customer support and things like that. But how has that changed since COVID? And also since, folks are working remote and you might get developers who are working out of Costa Rica or what are some of the geographies not to generalize, but where are some of the best developers? Like, where are you hearing or finding, or even in our space, are there any geographies that are, people might be surprised about?
Yeah. So I mean, I can only comment on my limited experience with this, but I would say like South America has a lot of really good developers. We've been having a really, I don't know if I'd say lucky streak or we found an outsourcing agency or not an agency, but a vendor or like an
Right.
outsourcing team, and they've been able to uh, really help us and on a like they've been submitting candidates that we could potentially contract and for short term. So there's two questions here. The first one was, is there any like specific like locations that you'd
Yeah.
be
How's that?
surprised to get
Yeah.
good developers from? So South America, Brazil, Argentina specifically has been kind of like my hotspot lately. I really like Spanish speakers. My last name's Bandola, so like I have
Yeah.
Spanish heritage, and it's not like the same, but I really like working with a lot of these guys. They have a positive attitude, and so that's been nice. But I'd say like places in like Europe, like Estonia, and like there's another place. You, I mean, I want to say Ukraine, but they're kind of like a no-fly zone right now.
And a challenge.
Uh,
Yeah. But
yeah.
historically, Ukraine and Russia, you know. What about by domain expertise? Like is there a country where it's like AI or
Mm, I'd say I'd say the States is probably where you want to hire AI
uh,
researchers and engineers from.
mm,
Still, just because that's where, as far as I've seen, the majority of the work is being discovered and advanced.
right.
So the United States is a pretty great place for AI for like, but for like apps, like if you need uh, an app that runs on like a phone, actually,
Yeah.
believe it or not, if you can find the right outsourcing teams in India, they actually do have, they can build you apps like quite quickly, and usually the quality is okay if you can find the right team for it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's a couple of
No
places.
doubt.
The first question you asked though was where how has COVID kind of affected outsourcing?
Yeah.
Um, I would say COVID made outsourcing more viable than it's ever been. The reason is because developers had to leave the office, so everyone became remote. And that was essentially at least for me, the hesitation with going through outsourcing is because you want developers to be in the building, around the table, people can just talk to each other. But because of COVID, everyone had to do this. Everyone had to go remote, which means finding, since we're all just like people on a screen in
Yeah.
Slack or Teams or whatever you're using, uh, you can kind of individually evaluate each member of the team based on their involvement in contributing code, contributing to conversations in team communications like Slack. Um, and it kind of almost like there's almost no difference when you're all working remote, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
I guess even the technology has adapted to not sort of enable that. What has happened to pricing in terms of um, what it's costing to hire a good engineer over the last few years? Has it become more costly or has it become, there's been tons of layoffs, but I don't know if they've been layoffs have been in the engineering sector. What has happened to the cost of hiring good engineers, if anything?
yeah, I want to say that the good engineers, I think it's gone up. For
Yeah.
the average engineer, it's gone down. Like, if you're a couple years in, you're probably not making as much as you were a couple years in 3 or 4 years ago, right?
Mhm.
So 3 or 4 years ago, um, an intermediate developer could make really good money. That's just because of the need in the tech industry in largely the States, where there's a lot of investment, a lot of races to build the first thing or the best thing. There's the whole like app rush. Um, and then as new technologies have come out, like I said, like a lot of these systems have kind of become homogenous. So
Yeah.
what used to take a team of say 4 intermediate developers that you'd each pay 100 grand, now you can maybe get away with like 2 developers or 2 intermediate developers or 1 senior, and get the same or better result. So it almost always pays to hire somebody who's more qualified, a little bit more money. And so that's why the top end has become, I think, a little bit more expensive.
Uh,
Also, the value of the top end, you have guys like AI researchers
yeah.
and but AI research, I'd say like graphics or GPU accelerated performance in within apps and web apps and things like that. These are all fairly difficult topics, so you need a really good guy, but also or girl.
Yeah.
But but when but the value that these features or that these additions to your technology stack adds to your company is exponentially larger than just having like another landing page or having another view on an app with like a button and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
because there's so many more developers, you can kind of get the same for less now on
Yeah.
that middle tier. But for the high end, these guys and girls are, I think it's more expensive and probably for a good reason. I think to a large extent, you want to be paid according to the problems you can
Yeah.
solve and the value that it adds. So,
Last question. I got to ask the obligatory AI related question. But
mhm.
I think as it relates to pricing, this might be interesting. But I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about the impact of AI. But have you started to see and experience the impact of um, the assumption that engineers are leveraging AI to help with coding, and has that decreased the value of engineers? Like, do you think, the question that keeps on that's sort of part of the original debate is, do you think, AI will be able to replace
AI
engineers?
is AI is going to take my job, right?
Yeah.
So at least at beginning of 2024, I've felt and seen none of that effect,
Okay.
right? AI is not taking our jobs yet.
Yeah.
I think AI is going to take everybody's job eventually.
Right.
But I do think that engineers will be some of the last jobs they take, at least, especially that top end, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But
what it
are
does though is
you,
it takes
go ahead.
really difficult things to implement or to understand, and you can use AI as a developer to explain a topic to you, to explain something that you're trying to build to you, and then use what you're learning from AI to build it faster, quicker, better. Um, as well as like not, I mean, I've got to shout out like GitHub Copilot in this instance, right? Because our whole team is using it. This is kind of a joke, but Sean, our CEO, was talking to me the other day, and he's like, "Hey, can you give me like a percentage of how much of our code is commented and how much of it has like good documentation?" And I said, "Sean, we use Copilot. All we write is documentation, and the AI writes the code for us." And
What
that's
a flip.
yeah, all we write is comments. That's not true. That's not true.
It used to be,
And the
where's
code
the
doc,
documentation, right? Um,
yeah. So, but on the flip side, even if so, the truth is that I don't know, maybe like 30% of our code is like actually code commented.
right.
We use different techniques for readability and maintainability, like variable naming, function naming, like semantics and things like that. That makes our code a lot easier to read and therefore more maintainable. Um, but I also want to comment on specifically for that problem, you can get with Copilot workspaces now. You can take your whole project, put it in a Copilot workspace, and then say function by function, write documentation for this. It might not be 100% up like the way you like it, but then you just go in and change it to whatever it should be, and then you kind of get all these like templates, and you get a great starter on having those that documentation written for you. And then in addition to that, you can have it write tests for your functions. So you can almost use AI to have a fully tested app. And it's not quite there. I haven't seen a whole lot of teams implementing this, but we're very excited as these new features are released, and we're excited to get to the bottom of like what does it look like as a developer, as an engineer, as a project manager to issue tasks, issue different development work to be done, and then to document it and test it almost automatically using these AI tools. It's something that we're really looking forward to seeing that boost. Something that we're not quite doing yet, but
Well,
it's
Stephen, I gotta get you back to talk about exactly that
yeah,
topic.
sure,
Yeah, because
anytime.
that sounds like something that'd be very interesting. Um, Thank you so much for the
Hmm.
conversation today,
Yeah, thank
and
you.
we definitely love to have you back. And for everybody who's been listening in, if you want to learn more about Outforce, we are at outforce.ai. Until the next episode, we will see you soon.